Right. The focus for the first part of this episode, Chris, is going to be what on earth is going on with Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
So let's rewind the clock back a bit to the briefings that were circulating amongst Westminster journalists earlier on in the week.
Beginning of the week. So the way it worked, and I know we've done a little bit in this in earlier episodes of Newscast, but I'll sort of try and unpack it, and you guys chip in as well, because I'm conscious that from a newscaster's perspective, we should try and lift the veil as much as we can around how these sort of things happen. So I spend most mornings at Westminster drinking cups of tea with people and trying to find out what's going on. And the usual convention of those conversations is that they are, to use the journalistic parlance, off the record. In other words, the people who I'm talking to know that they're talking to a journalist, and they know that I can report what it is I hear, but that I'm not going to name them or reveal anything that identifies kind of who they are, particularly for those who might be able to piece it together if it was too revealing. And that's a convention in journalism, and in particular in political journalism, which I think reflects the sort of human convention. Andrew Marrs talked about this in one of his books when he talked about the shade of journalism, that all of us do that in our own lives, on and off the record, because if we all lived our entire lives on the record and just said absolutely everything we were thinking 100% candor 100% of the time, none of us would survive the day in a relationship, a job, or anything else. So it's kind of, if you like, a professionalisation of that convention. So just to explain that.
Yeah.
And I reckon 95% of the conversations I have in this job are off the record. And then some of it appears above the surface. If you only consumed... If journalism was only on the record at Westminster, you would have an incredibly partial sense or sort of veneer sense of what was going on. Anyway, done that. So I'm doing my usual coffees on Tuesday, and I'm having some conversations. Most of these conversations, by the way, are little bits that I'll throw into reporting here and there, or squirrel away and use 3 weeks later or whatever. Just occasionally you get told something and you think, whoa, hang on a minute, this is newsy right now. And it's a news story on its own, not just as a supplement to something else. And that was what was happening on Tuesday, and I'd had various conversations. Thought, there's a story here. And I was talking to a few colleagues and comparing notes, talking to Henry Zeffman, our chief political correspondent, and what have you heard, and blah, blah, blah. And we started working up a news story. As we were doing that and then making further conversations, it became apparent, and I was not aware of this when I was having these conversations, that variations on the conversation that I had had, maybe with similar or the same people, I don't know, were happening with others. Because the Times had a story, so Patrick Maguire at the Times had a story which they were talking about, which had some overlap and similarities. Pippa Crerar at The Guardian had a story that was similar. Bloomberg had a story that was similar. And they were all appearing at roughly the same time.
In other words, this had been done sort of proactively because the person really wanted this idea out there.
The person or people, I think we can reasonably conclude. As I say, I didn't know that at the time. I genuinely didn't know that at the time. And in fact, when I was talking to somebody in government about the story that we had, they said, there was a sort of roll of the eyes. And I thought, I wonder if they think we've got a similar story, because at that point I was aware of something the Times was doing. And they then mentioned The Guardian, and that was the first I'd heard of their story.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think it's reasonable to conclude there was an element of coordination going on. And there was a desire that it was known that the Prime Minister was going to be defiant if he faced a leadership challenge. In other words, and the reason this matters is he wanted it communicated that he would not be persuaded to just pack in the job, giving potentially one person a relatively, as easy as these things ever are, clean passage towards becoming Prime Minister. There would be a contest, etc., etc. And, and
in other words, so if there'd been a sort of Margaret Thatcher style, loads of members of the cabinet saying you've got to go, even though that was in the context of a leadership contest itself, he would say, get lost. Yeah. I won an election 15 months ago. I'm sticking around. And if you want to challenge me, come and take me on if you're hard enough. Basically was the And then also in those conversations featured particular references to Wes Streeting, the health secretary, and what they felt was the potential, the talk of a challenge and campaigning and plotting and scheming and all the rest of it. So, we reported this news, as did various other outlets, and it was headline news, as it was always likely to be. And frankly, it would have been even without the Wes Streeting stuff, by the way, in my view. Collectively in government, particularly
those in and around the Prime Minister were taken aback by the scale of the
Right.
headlines that this generated. And basically all hell broke loose, and there was mudslinging left, right and centre all day yesterday, Wednesday. And then here on Thursday, as we record, there has been a pretty desperate attempt to hose the whole thing down. But the reason it matters, I'm conscious this is a rather long monologue, but you've got 25 hours.
Fine, take as long as you like.
The reason this really matters, over and above all the Westminster shenanigans and sources and briefing and all that kind of stuff, is this is symptomatic of a Prime Minister who is vulnerable and a government that is vulnerable, and they know it.
Yeah, Ailbhe, I went for a run yesterday and I was thinking about this, and by the time I got back from my run, I think I'd come up with about 6 or 7 reasons why this had not worked out well for the government. Number one being it brought to the public gaze conversations that lots of people have been having in private. That was reason number one. I don't know how many reasons you may have, 20 or fewer, I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's completely legitimised leadership speculation. Like the New Statesman cover this week was asking, does Keir Starmer realise how much trouble he's in? And number 10 helpfully has told us yes. Exactly as
they may have
Chris
inadvertently realised, but they have now been shown, yeah.
But I mean, the second the stories like Chris's landed all at the same time, Guardian Times as well, people were messaging me saying Morgan's lost the plot, referring to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. People around him completely deny that he was responsible for these briefings against Wes Streeting, but it doesn't, he's still nevertheless being blamed by most people in the Labour Party for it. And just, it was seen immediately as a massive strategic error. And that was only reinforced when Wes Streeting did the morning broadcast round.
Which he was always going to do, because that's a scheduled thing where there's almost like a rota.
Yeah, and he's very good at it. And I mean, as one person put it to me, he had them on toast. His whoever had been briefing against him,
What did he do that was so good and so toast-worthy?
Well, so he sort of professed his loyalty to the Prime Minister and made lots of quite good traitors references, insisting that he was, this was a sort of mad conspiracy theory. Lots of kind of good cultural references and jokes. But then actually he kind of stuck the knife in. He basically said the Prime Minister needs to fire whoever's responsible for this. There's a toxic culture of briefing from number 10. Lucy Powell, the new deputy leader of the Labour Party, was completely right. And, thank goodness this time they're briefing against a man, meaning, these briefings often tend to be pretty sexist, directed at women. So he really took the gloves off, and it ended up not really being a story about Wes Streeting in the end. We weren't saying, oh, what has Wes Streeting been plotting? Does he need to go? It was much more, does the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff need to go? Did number 10 sanction this? This is so messy. It kind of just massively backfired on them.
And just before we bring it really up to date to what happened today on Thursday, Chris, just Faisal, one of the rationale, what's the singular for rationale? Rationales. Oh, well, they're answering all the big questions here. One of the reasons that allies of Keir Starmer gave for why it would be a bad idea for him to go in whatever way was because the bond markets would react really badly. In other words, the interest rate on government debt would go up because the people that lend the government money would be worried that his replacement would spend loads or not get control of the public finances. It would be a disaster. What did you make of that as a rationale?
Well, we've heard a version of this before, haven't we? It was used against Andy Burnham when he popped up to say hello at the Labour conference. Was that?
Or just before.
Yeah. And they got an FT front page out of that, and that seemed to be part of the attempt to kind of squash that brief Burnham initiative. But on this occasion, it seems to stretch things a bit. I'll just say like that. I mean, it does remind me of the old American political consultant James Carville, who knew Bill Clinton very well, but said when he gets reincarnated, he wants to come back as a bond trader because they have actual power. And so clearly they're using this as a sort of bludgeon to try and say the only answer to the question, how can we keep the markets in check, is the current Prime Minister and Chancellor duet, which is kind of interesting, but I wonder if it only works once. And indeed, people were speculating that the markets would hate the problems and the trouble. I mean, but the bond yields went down on the day after this happened. So maybe they didn't interpret the threat as being serious, or maybe they weren't that bothered if someone else did come in. I guess Wes Streeting is not thought to be the sort of person that would kind of suddenly borrow loads of money and
although the argument that is made, for what it's worth, is that were there to be a contest, the instinct, given where the centre of gravity would be within the Labour Party, there would be a temptation for candidates to tack left, or to suggest that the current government's approach to borrowing could be somehow more liberal, along the lines of Andy Burnham's argument of a couple of months ago. And in so doing, that argument would be something, so goes the argument, that would spook the markets. Just one little thing picking up on the conversation earlier, which is an argument I have heard that is, if you like, a counter to, not a counter, it's just an additional point when you look at the sort of mudslinging of the last 36 hours, which is the argument that says a motivating factor in the decision for people like me to be briefed as we were the other day was a fear that there was a very short-term threat to the Prime Minister, perhaps coming immediately after the budget, and that this was an attempt to prevent that from happening. And bear with me as we walk our way through this. Yes, there's been all this stuff in the last couple of days, and Wes Streeting's morning round, at which even those who are not his greatest fans say he handled very well. But the theory goes, would it be easier or harder now for him? And we should emphasise he has emphasised that he is currently, he's loyal to the Prime Minister, etc., etc. But is it easier or harder as a result of the last couple of days for him in a couple of weeks, hypothetically, to be able to say, I'll tell you what,
I was loyal 2 weeks ago, but not today.
I'll take on the Prime Minister. Now, some might think that was always highly unlikely at this point anyway, but the folk I've been speaking to, there was, real or not, a genuine fear that there was a possibility of a challenge in this side of Christmas. And maybe, just maybe, goes the theory, the last couple of days has made that less likely.
Is this a reaction to the day after the Caerphilly by-election, which had been Labour since democracy was born, pretty much? I exaggerate, because that was in ancient Greece 2,000-something years ago. When Labour lost it and Plaid Cymru won it in the Senedd by-election, and Wes Streeting's reaction was to compare it to Labour losing the Hartlepool by-election under Boris Johnson, which we now know from various books and histories was the moment at which Keir Starmer thought about resigning as leader of the opposition.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't a helpful thing for Wes Streeting to say, in retrospect, was it? I don't think it was just that. I mean, to what Chris was saying, it does sound as though specific MPs said to people in Number 10 about a very specific plan that Wes Streeting allegedly had 50 ministers ready to resign in the aftermath of the budget, which I have to say, I don't know what you've heard, Chris, really surprises me, because there's constant speculation around Wes Streeting, comments like that Caerphilly by-election and loads of other slightly interesting things he has said. But, I think from speaking to other people in Westminster as well, other journalists, we hadn't heard the very specific plan thing. And yet the argument from people inside Number 10 is that, anyone in Westminster with their ear to the ground knew of this plot. Well, certainly I didn't, and I don't know if other journalists had. I think maybe someone might have reported it if we knew with the certainty that Number 10 thought it had. So there's a whole
because if they knew, you'd know.
Well, you'd think so, or
especially
Chris
if there's 50 people involved.
But what was interesting in some of the briefing, just to go back to your point about Caerphilly and Hartlepool, is that Hartlepool featured, the reference to Hartlepool featured in some of the briefing, saying this is not a Hartlepool moment. In other words, the point that he wouldn't consider walking away.
I want to know how competent this sort of action is, or is it blundering? And so the example would be, they knew that Streeting was going to be on the morning round, or did they not? I mean, did they know, and this was a sort of trap for him, which he didn't walk into, or did they not realise, and it's incompetent? What's your bet?
I think they did know. And by the way, when I was briefed, I didn't know. It was much later. It was when I was writing up our story, and someone said, without even knowing what I was writing, by the way, there was just a bit of chat in the newsroom about the morning after. Oh, the health secretary is. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but they have a grid in Downing Street, don't they, about the main thing they want to be the news about the government.
It's a total so
it was known within. It was known within government.
I think Westminster loves to gossip about this sort of thing. Lots of speculation about who Chris's sources were, who Pippa's sources were. There's a lot of gossip at the moment about who were the people who told Number 10 of this really specific plan that none of us journalists were aware of, and would maybe someone else who wanted to be leader of the Labour Party have maybe put that into circulation.
As a triple bluff.
That's what the Labour Party is all gossiping about at the moment.
But then, Chris, it brings us then the story right up to date to Thursday afternoon, where there was the briefing from the Prime Minister's official spokesperson and their press secretary to the lobby journalists at lunchtime. And they said Keir Starmer chatted to all his senior advisors this morning on Thursday and received a reassurance that nobody in Number 10 Downing Street had pointed the finger at Wes Streeting. Now, the crucial thing is that doesn't address the first part of the briefing, which was the Prime Minister would stand and fight.
So this is where we can tease things out a little bit, in that I think an element of the... I'm having to be quite careful here because I'm just making sure I assemble my sentences in a way that does that thing.
This is like Guess Who.
Well, no, it's so important. The sacrosanct nature of... But this is the way I'll do it. So one of the reasons that this blew up in the way that it did so spectacularly is an element of this. There's two parts to this. There was the desire from some to communicate a defiance from the Prime Minister about what he would do in a scenario where he was challenged, i.e., I'm sticking around. And then separate to that was the whole business of Wes Streeting. And I think two things went on which took various people by surprise. Thing one was, I don't think they had anticipated that the first strand of the story about the defiance would be as newsworthy as it turned out to be. I mean, I'd say it's pretty newsworthy. Let's ignore Wes Streeting. That's pretty newsworthy when a Prime Minister...
Even the fact of having to do it.
Well, even the fact of having to do it, and you've got a massive majority, and you've been in power for 15 months, and then you feel like you want to make that note. That is a top drawer political news story. I think there was perhaps an element of surprise about its scale, and I think they imagined it would appear in a more modest way, and clearly it didn't. What then put, rocket boosters under it was the stuff around the health secretary, not least because he was on the morning round and therefore he was directly addressing it, and that then transforms a story that is actually, particularly in broadcast, I'm not expecting any tiny violins, but particularly because it's actually quite hard to tell because you're talking about conversations, you've got nothing to show, you can't say who you've been talking to. In a different scenario, the health secretary might not have charged towards the cameras, and even if he had, he wouldn't have done however many interviews he did, and a speech, and then questions and all the rest of it. Suddenly,
then more interviews today.
Well, and so
probably a 24-hour podcast.
Well, you can appear on the screen. The story suddenly, in televisual terms, is suddenly much easier to tell. In addition to the fact that, of course, when you were then talking about the ambitions of a particular person, who has got a track record of having said very honestly, and as I often say on Newscast, there's nothing ignoble about being ambitious in politics or indeed in anything else. And he has answered the question before directly, would you like to be Prime Minister one day, with a yes, which very few people will actually do. So, that story all started slotting into place in terms of but there's the two elements, as I say, so we can detach the two elements. And when you read some of the remarks, actually, I'm going to stop at that.
No, but that was very, very illuminating, and I can see why you're treading through that minefield very carefully.
And I guess to demonstrate Chris's point, the New Statesman reported the first chunk of that, the defiance that he would face the leadership challenge, but I didn't hear any of those people mentioning Wes Streeting.
Okay.
We attribute that to a senior Number 10 source, so you can see how the two things have been sort of intertwined in some stories.
Now, Faisal, this was an unorthodox thing that then already was happening in an unorthodox thing, which is the Chancellor going out and doing interviews and going on the record talking about what she's going to do at the budget 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the budget, including that speech she did in Downing Street at breakfast time last week.
Yes, we've had a few of these sorts of interventions. I think you guys call it pitch rolling, which is a cricket metaphor, isn't it?
I believe so.
It is a cricket metaphor. And then
Jonathan Agnew's coming on one of the last hours of our 25-hour podcast.
It was Cameron that sort of that filtered it into our main
lexicon.
Stream. Exactly. And they're clearly trying to prepare the ground and do some expectations management, which may in the end be sort of defied by some amazing piece of fiscal wizardry. I'm going to guess. I'm always struck by what happened last year, where for some reason, I think I know why this happened, but his very specific story was allowed to run that then she used as her white rabbit as not doing, which was the idea that the income tax thresholds would be frozen for another couple of years. Now, we resisted that story, but I know why others went for it, put it on their front pages, and in the end, it didn't happen. So that is a salutary lesson in terms of the absolute expectation of certain fiscal measures that are now almost baked in. But there clearly was a case being made to prepare the ground for tax rises with specific reasons, an acknowledgement that a backward assessment by the OBR of the past of our economic performance has revealed an economy with more scars. They've projected that forward, and that's created a bigger permanent gap that they will use as the argument. So they've prepared the use of a button which says we'll break the manifesto. Now, the extent to which they actually do that, I think, is still up for grabs. And whether they do it in a way that they might argue, if you like, breaks the letter but not the spirit of the manifesto. Whether they can argue, whether when you say you've broken the manifesto to Rachel Reeves when she sat here in a couple of weeks' time, and she will say, well, we had to do something, but actually we've still protected people's pay packets.
Is this just to flush this out? Is this this idea that's doing the rounds, isn't it? Where you put up income tax, but you take down national insurance. That is a breach of the manifesto, straightforwardly.
Income tax has gone up, but I'm saying that what they'll argue when you say that, which you will say that, they will say we had to do something big.
Sure,
but actually we've protected. The specific claim was on working families, and sorry, it was working people. Define that, and we've done something to address that. So the major incidence of the tax rise will be on, in this case, which is why I do think it's the most likely as we stand here, on savers, on landlords, on some forms of high earning pension, on some forms of expensive property in some. I think they're going to try and draw a narrative. I think that the tax rises that came in the past went on working people, and we have tried, in trying to generate extra revenue to pay for public services, we have tried to protect various people the best we can. But what can we do with all these events that are going around the world? Now that's their story. Now clearly it's questionable. It can be interrogated. As I said, I'm just a bit alive to the fact that there's a lot of preparation of the ground happening. There's still quite a lot of moving parts.
So you've given us a lot to think about the budget. Ailbhe, just give us some things to think about in the next few days, as I'm sure the pressure on Morgan McSweeney will continue to build. So just give us some things about him so that when people hear his name, they'll be like, oh, that's the guy.
Oh, a brief pen portrait.
Yeah.
He's Irish, from Macroom in County Cork. Came over to England, worked on building sites, I think. Went to Israel, worked on a kibbutz for a bit, went to uni, didn't much like it, and worked.
Which is all quite an intriguing background for a Downing Street Chief of Staff, isn't it?
And I think sort of was quite disillusioned with the Ireland that he left behind in terms of being quite socially conservative and oppressed, and then sort of made his life in England and worked, I think, basically at the reception desk of Labour HQ, sort of doing like admin for Peter Mandelson, and no one knew who he was. Became a kind of local campaign organiser. In places like Barking, fighting the BNP, in Lambeth, working closely with Steve Reid, who's now a cabinet minister, fighting the hard left of the Labour Party. And it's those moments, sort of fighting the BNP and fighting the hard left of the Labour Party, that have been quite formative for him in sort of shaping his politics. He doesn't have any time for the left of the Labour Party, for the Corbynites at all. That's not really a secret. He sort of then became chief of staff to Keir Starmer. He was kind of planning for quite a while before that about how he could pull back Labour from the Corbynites, but sort of had this plan in opposition to completely change the Labour Party, and he did. Obviously had a bit of a rivalry with Sue Gray, who was the original chief of staff in Number 10. He replaced her. He's sort of, depending on who you speak to, he's really admired in the Labour Party as a sort of master campaigner, and frankly loathed by other people. He's a real lightning rod for frustration with sort of how the leader's office is run. Going back to opposition, people sort of feel like there's a boys' club culture in Number 10. So, all the things we were talking about with Wes Streeting earlier.
Is that who he's talking about?
Yeah, well, him and the sort of and his allies, really. And people, I think, lots of Labour insiders don't really distinguish between the two. It's sort of it's Morgan McSweeney and his pals, and of course, because he's chief of staff and an advisor, he can't speak for himself, so he can't sort of actually come on here and sort of say his own take on any of that.
Brilliant summary, Chris. The premise and the assumption of my question to Ailbhe there was that actually the pressure will continue to build on Morgan McSweeney, because it sort of feels like there's a bit of momentum around that, but of course it might dissipate over the next few days.
It could do in the short term, possibly. I think the reason why the focus so often ends up on him is that, as Ailbhe was saying, because he was there within, if you like, the Starmer project almost before Keir Starmer, or at least his vision of how he thought the Labour Party could haul itself off the canvas and potentially win again. He is of outsized significance, and that's an understatement. He is of an outsized significance to Keir Starmer's political project in government. So there is the sort of loving and loathing thing that goes on, but then there are those who will make the argument, and I think there's something in it, that when they are firing pot shots at Morgan McSweeney, they are in so doing firing pot shots at Keir Starmer, and people wonder how viable a Keir Starmer project might be were Morgan McSweeney not to be there. And now chiefs of staff are always important to prime ministers, but as I say, in this instance, I think you can make a solid case that says he is disproportionately so.
Ailbhe, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Faisal, thank you.
Great to be here.
Chris, thanks for coming in.
Good luck with the next little while.